My guest today is Dr. Michael Bonner, who has written In Defense of Civilization, which I've holding up here. And it says that you speak Greek, Latin, Persian, Aramaic, Hebrew, and modern French. And what languages don't you speak?
Well, I mean, if we say speak, it's a slight exaggeration. But Nassim Taleb, who wrote that, was being very generous, but he omitted Armenian. So I do actually I studied Armenian and I passed my exams in it. So I can claim that I know classical Armenian, but I wouldn't be able to have a conversation in ancient Armenian or classical Syriac or Aramaic or whatever. I could probably fake my way through some Latin, but once we had to start talking about anything, sort of up to date or modern or whatever, I probably wouldn't be able to do that. But yeah, that's my background in languages, and that's where I started as a classicist, and my interest in history grew from there.
Hmm. And I discussed this, speaking of when you mentioned this, I would discuss this in another episode about Latin, where a while ago, that there's a difference, right, between actually reading Latin and like having a verbal conversation. Like I studied a little bit of Spanish myself, so I can have a basic conversation, I think, in Spanish. I mean,
Mm.
we'll get back to the history in a second, but I just want to mention this. But it's kind of a difference between speaking verbally as studying Latin for scripture than actually having a smart conversation in Latin. For example,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you're sort of hemmed in partly by vocabulary.
mm,
There's no Latin word for nuclear submarine or computer, things like that. Although I think the Vatican they keep a sort of word list of words that you can use, but I'm not sure how you know
how
widely.
relevant it would be.
Yeah, but then of course um, the way the texts that you have in front of you, like Virgil or Cicero, nobody ever talked like Virgil, and I think that Cicero is, if you compare that to sort of Latin inscriptions that you find on walls, or papyri, or the small number of documents that have survived, like you'll see that's kind of an idiosyncratic, highly literary form of Latin, which I think is that's derived sort of mostly from Greek, Greek examples, and highly polished and intricate. Nobody really talked that way.
Hmm. So let's begin with your book and the title, In Defense of Civilization. How did that? It's a rather interesting title, I think. And how did it tell us how the book came about?
Ah, right. Well, look, let's first of all, we should say the title is just, it's just a title. I mean, the there was one reviewer so far, and he claimed he was all sort of disappointed and everything because, he expected, some sort of like list of things to do to, literally defend civilization. I think that, we shouldn't take the title too literally. The book amounts to a defense, or like a rehabilitation of the concept of civilization, that it is a useful, valuable, meaningful concept that we should still use. We should still use the word. We should not forget it. We should not treat it, ironically or anything like that. But you have to have some kind of title that's going to draw people in. The second half of the title, how our past can renew our present. The clue is in there, that I wanted to write a book that sort of confronted, I think, some of the problems that the West in particular, but also all people, I think, everywhere in the world right now are faced with, and sort of examine them from an historical perspective, and to look at this sort of cycle of what you might call the rise and fall of civilization, the rise and fall of states, or the sort of you know, coming together of communities of people, and then their dissolution, and then coming back together again. The fundamental idea was that I wanted to show that a lot of the trends that people are upset about, whether it's, you know, political fragmentation, the decline of family formation, religious sectarian tensions, climate change, you know, whatever it is that people are worried about, or, you know, troubled by, that all of this is old. We've seen it all before. We have got through it all before, sometimes not very well, sometimes not at all. As we know, there are civilizations from the very, very ancient world that are no more, and that were completely forgotten until they were dug out of the ground, like Sumeria, Sumer and Akkad and so forth. And so the idea that we are either on this sort of inexorable upward trend of progress, or a sort of irreversible downward trend of decline and collapse and so forth, neither of those are really true on their own, but there is a sense in which they are both true, that there is an ebb and flow to these things, and we can, you know, there are things that we can do that either accelerate or arrest the decline, and there are things that happen in the past that achieve sort of great revivals and improvements. And Europeans will probably immediately think of the Renaissance and so forth, but I wanted to show that that is part of a much larger pattern, as well as our present state of the thing, present state of decline, or whatever you want to call it. It's all part of a much, much bigger picture, which makes far more sense, I think, if you sort of zoom out and see it all in a larger historical perspective. That's why I wanted to write the book. It came out of pandemic lockdowns. I wanted to have some kind of project. I was, you know, like I think many people, I was very worried about the state of things and wanted to sort of come to grips with understanding it.
And let's begin with, of course, as you open the book, what is civilization, and what's better place to start than ancient Rome, where I think what immediately think most people think about civilization. And I want to bring up, as you know, the Greeks and the Romans think of other people as barbarians. It doesn't even like them. Of course, though, we know that barbary, as the Greek version, is of course just people that don't speak Greek, as the original means. Because let's begin talking about what the Roman civilization.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned this concept of being a barbarian. I mean, from the Greek perspective, the Romans would have been, you know, no less barbarous than, you know, practically anyone else that they called barbarian. But of course, from the Greek perspective, there was always a tension, I think, between you know, their sort of fear of foreigners, or their fear of foreigners and their preference for themselves, as well as a sort of feeling of inferiority when confronted with the far older and more powerful cultures of the old world. So the two big ones are Egypt and Persia. Plato was notably in awe of Egyptian achievements, particularly their very ancient literary heritage, and their far, far, far older, more expansive sense of history in comparison with the Athenians, who were you know, newcomers on the scene after the Bronze Age collapse. So for a guy like Plato, who obviously had a fair amount of confidence in his own civilization, he was in, you know, by no means you know, he was perfectly content to learn things from Egyptians, to imitate them, so on. As for Persia, there's even greater ambivalence. You have this sort of fear and hatred of a sort of great power that's, uh, you know, really the center of the civilized world at that point. And Greece is sort of on the periphery, and yet
If
somehow,
I may do an analogy here, it was Persia was kind of what Islam would later be in medieval world to the Greeks. They were kind of the Islamic world to the Europeans in antiquity, if that's a decent analogy of things.
yeah, I think that's fair. So they would look at them, with a mixture of admiration, envy, and there is some element of hatred there. But even if you read Aeschylus or even certain passages in Plato, you can see that they acknowledge a well-ordered, powerful state that was a model of stability and artistic and cultural achievement. But those, I don't want to give the impression that those two examples are somehow exceptional. They aren't really exceptional. Consider what we know about the philosopher Pythagoras. Pythagoras is said to have traveled throughout the Near East, Egypt, and Syria, and to have picked up his ideas from there. Now, that isn't an aberration at all. The Greek alphabet came from the Near East. Much of their architectural structures or concepts are originally inspired from Near Eastern models. So I wanted to show as best I could that this idea of a kind of innovation that comes out of the Mediterranean sort of Greco-Roman world that is somehow the foundation of our own civilization, that isn't true. It's not as though they had no achievements, but they are both harking back to a very distant past, so distant that they don't remember it. They've picked up the wreckage from after the Bronze Age collapse, and it has been sort of reassembled in the form of a common Mediterranean civilization, which the Greeks and their Phoenician trading friends pushed ever further westward, and the Etruscans imitated this, and the Etruscans were then imitated by Rome. But of course, you have the example of Carthage, which Rome, always portrayed as sort of the great enemy, the great evil empire that they superseded, but they also imitated them. The whole concept of a Mediterranean empire is fundamentally a Carthaginian one, Carthage itself being a colony of Phoenician traders. And if Rome had not been able to, if Rome had not inherited the Mediterranean world as a unit, or more or less a unit, from Carthage, there would have been no Roman Empire. So cultures, civilizations imitate one another. They look back to the past. They are rooted in the past. And what used to be called the Greek miracle, this idea of this sort of explosion of innovation after the Bronze Age collapse, isn't true.
Now, I want to go back in time a little bit because we're going to talk about India and after, of course, Alexander's conquest. So we are going back and forth here, but of course, it had massive consequences. The collapse of Alexander's newborn empire that didn't even last 10 years, I think. It's collapsed immediately. So what was the consequences of this that gave birth to the Hellenistic age?
I probably should have talked a little bit more about the Hellenistic age, but I think that, I don't want to belittle it, but I think that it was somewhat less influential than we might prefer to think. The notion of an international empire that sort of bestrides several continents with a sort of imperial center, and a sort of well-organized bureaucracy and so forth. That has ancient precedent, obviously, in the Mesopotamian states, but on the scale that it reached later on, it's fundamentally an Iranian idea. And when Alexander the Great seizes the Achaemenid Empire, basically swallowing it whole, you have a very brief moment where, as someone like Plutarch would say, you have sort of the two, you have a sort of union of barbarian and Greco-Macedonian ruling over the entire civilized world. Obviously that's a big exaggeration, but the point is that in very short order, the Macedonian conquerors of Iran get pulled by the gravitational force of that civilization into something that is really, quite different. It isn't exactly, we call it Hellenism and so forth, but it's really the being pulled into the tide, or the sort of dissolved into a larger Iranian civilization. And ultimately the Macedonian conquest, it just doesn't hold, it doesn't take. It's eventually superseded, I think, fairly quickly by another Iranian dynasty. And obviously you find, there's influence of Macedonian art, or Greco-Macedonian art throughout Eurasia. You find it cropping up in Buddhist art. It's very beautiful, very attractive art from Gandhara and so forth. But ultimately, Alexander and his successors are trying to run an Iranian state. They intermarry with the locals. They try to carry on the legacy of the Achaemenids, Alexander being sort of the last of the Achaemenids and so forth. But it doesn't hold. They get absorbed. An Iranian dynasty replaces them, and that's that. It's an example of the potency, I think, of the Iranian concept of empire, Iranian civilization, religion, and so forth. And it's not the last time that this happens. In many ways, it prefigures the Arab Islamic conquest of Iran, in which the Arabs also get sort of absorbed within a sort of indigenous stream of civilization within Iran. And it's paralleled with the many sort of nomadic conquest of China also. But you mentioned also India. The Indian angle, I think, is very significant. I had not known about it until I sat down to write this book, or had hardly reflected on it. The Achaemenid Empire, the first Iranian empire, was extraordinarily influential on India, and the Mauryan state owes a great debt to Achaemenid models, right down to borrowing the Aramaic alphabet, which was used to write it was used within the Achaemenid bureaucracy and used to write some of Ashoka's inscriptions. The idea of building in stone, copying the architectural styles of the palace at Persepolis, and the erection of Ashoka's pillars all over India, marking the boundaries of his empire and so forth. And you even wonder to some extent whether the Qin unification of China, which occurred at roughly the same time, whether that was also inspired in some measure by the memory of the Achaemenid Empire and by the Mauryan state in India.
And of course, as you know, the Romans did be talking about collapse of civilizations. The Romans did collapse eventually, and of course, this is where we consider the start of or the Western Roman Empire collapsed
Yeah.
eventually. If to correct myself, and this of course launched. As we were talking about in the beginning, empires collapse, civilization collapse. So, how did Europe and the remains of the Roman Empire, if you will, deal with the collapse? As we stated this before on the podcast, that they didn't really, at least in the beginning, they didn't really think of it as collapse. For them, lives just went, oh no, we're not Romans anymore. We're Italians now, it wasn't like that, but of course, let's talk about after the aftermath of the Roman civilization.
Hmm. Well, yeah, at some point in the 20th century, the idea came about that what happened in Western Europe was not a collapse. It was some sort of, very gradual evolution to something new. And although I agree, something new came. I mean, we can no longer steer around the idea that there was indeed a violent and precipitous collapse in the West. Roman government banished, without which there was, anarchy, pillaging, violence everywhere. It was really quite bad. We can also tell, for me, what was pretty decisive, that if you look at ice samples from the polar ice caps, you can see that um, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere in Western Europe plunges back down to sort of prehistoric levels with the collapse of the Roman state. Industry is gone. Trade has practically disappeared. The courts have stopped doing their business. Soldiers are no longer paid. It is a state collapse. There's no question about it. And yet that wasn't the end. As at the end of the Bronze Age collapse, or emerging out of the Bronze Age collapse, you have the sort of wreckage of the Assyrian state that manages to hold together, and they have their adventurous trading middlemen, the Phoenicians, who go off and so forth. They got stronger after the Bronze Age collapse. Similarly, in Western Europe, the church gets stronger, and it's that organization that remains a sort of repository of Roman civilization, right up until, arguably even right up until now. But
I remember you writing about this because now that you mention it, because as you write of the church as an institution, when everything's been troubled and when everything just went down, who remained the strong one, that brought people together, that was the church. You can say what of it was as you might, but as you will, and think of how many bad feelings about the church, if you will, but it did bring people together in the time of troubles.
It did, and it also maintained the functions of, well, maybe not all the functions. It maintained many of the functions of the Roman government, and it still commanded a level of prestige that no other surviving institution did. There was an emperor in Constantinople. There was no longer any kind of emperor. There may have been a governor hiding out in Ravenna somewhere, an exarch, but there was still a bishop of Rome, camped out in the ruins of the old imperial capital, and that was maybe not all that was required for maintaining authority and prestige, but it was certainly, it certainly did a lot. Then you have the sort of local bishops off in further north, who are basically, they've replaced Roman magistrates, and they're sort of doling out justice and making rulings within basilicas and so forth. So it's not only did it bring people together in some kind of social sense, but also in a political one, and other institutions had to maintain. For example, I'm thinking of things like monarchies like that of Clovis and later Charlemagne. They have to maintain. They're sort of borrowing a great deal of their prestige from the church, and they are ruling with its sanction. And the way I interpret that's a sort of ghost. I forget who called someone called the Roman Catholic Church the ghost of the Roman Empire, but that's I forget who it was. But that's sort of the lingering spirit of the old empire, and it's arguably still with us.
I was discussing this with some neighbors a while ago, and it's interesting, and like we talked about now, how people who go through a traumatic experience or suffer some losses, they're still, instead of going away from the church, that they go and get drawn towards a religious, what's it called, epiphany. Maybe I don't remember the word for it, but they get a you know I don't forget the word. Sorry about this, but they're drawn towards the church instead of away from it.
Yeah. Well, why do you think that is?
I don't know. I wish I could tell you. I mean, personally, I would not be. I don't think I would be drawn toward the church. I would rather feel like they did this. I don't know what. I don't know. I wish I could tell. I don't have an answer on the top of my head.
Well, I mean, I think that this is worth pursuing. I mean, an older sense of well, let me start again. A contemporary Western sense of religion, I think, grows out of the Reformation, and it isn't particularly ancient. And it's the idea that there's a kind of private, personal, devotional experience that is sort of, dwells sort of within you. And that isn't what the older institution of the church was like, and it's not what other religions, maybe not all, but it's not what most other religions are like. It's certainly not what the old Roman religion was like, to take a very obvious example. The older idea is it's much more of a social experience, that there's a sense of public corporate worship that brings a whole community together, and that in the Christian context, the church is a centerpiece of social and political life. As, for example, if you think of the medieval village or something, the parish church would be a sort of nexus of social interaction and of I'm not sure what the right phrase is, but apart from hosting fairs or festivals and so forth, it would also be the place where you would go to for all sort of you might go and play in the churchyard if you were a kid, or you could meet someone there to discuss some sort of important local matter or something. There would be sort of the equivalent of town hall meetings in there. It was a social nexus, and I think that in times of times of crisis or stress or what have you. I mean, I think that that's the kind of institution that you might still find a vestige of that in most parts of the world, even though I think a lot of people now view religion as a kind of private internal thing.
Speaking of religion, of course, and you do write about this as well. Another religion that was born around in the medieval era is, of course, Islam, and which conquered most of what the Arabic world. And of course, this has been disputed, but for the lack of better words, there was kind of a not really, but dark age in Europe, but the Islamic world would have an enlightenment, and they would have a bright age, if you will, in both
Yeah.
science, and they would prosper both in trade, both in, there are like the Abbasid Caliphate. They would have, they would prosper with, Islamic science up until 1258, and so let's talk about the, if you will, the not just a golden age, but golden ages of Islam.
Yeah, now that I've had some distance from writing the book, I think that I might have presented this development a little bit differently. What you are saying is exactly right, but the way I would approach it now is that there are two things that I would stress. The first is that the caliphate, the Abbasid caliphate, did not begin by thinking itself fundamentally superior to the peoples and the various heritages that it supplanted. Because if they had felt themselves superior, they would never have felt any kind of need to imitate them. So when you have caliphs, of course, it's debatable the involvement of the caliph, or whether it's sort of a more of a private thing. But when you have institutions and scholars and so forth rummaging through historical and scientific libraries, trying to get high quality texts to translate them into Arabic, and then writing letters to Constantinople asking for original manuscript, well, not manuscript, original texts of Aristotle and company. There was definitely a sense in which they felt that they had something to learn, and I think that that's an important lesson, for anybody at any time. And this was, the Abbasid Caliphate is sort of the superpower of the day, and yet their elites still felt that they had something to learn from the past. That's an important lesson for us, I think. Second, the knock-on effect of the Abbasid revival of scholarship is actually more far-reaching than you might think from my book. So the first thing is that you find that, yes, it's true, they're looking at sort of Greco-Roman and Persian heritage, and they're very interested in it, and that sort of encourages people to explore that stuff and to go even further and further afield. And you also get, because they're demanding manuscripts from Constantinople, you also get a revival of interest in the Greek heritage within Byzantium itself. That's very important.
If I may, in our episode we did a while ago on the House of Wisdom, we talked about there were even people as far as the Anglo-Saxon world who came to I believe there was the Abbasid Athelred among them, who came to learn, instead of going on crusade, they came to learn from Islamic science, and not just draw a major crusade from them, but he wanted to bring back what he learned back to England, which is
exactly
inspired both Roger and Francis Bacon with their work later.
Mm-hmm. So that's an excellent example. The knock-on effect goes as far as the Anglo-Saxon world, that Alfred the Great is ultimately, his sort of project of reviving learning. It's ultimately rooted in what the Abbasid scholars started. And that's because from Byzantium you go to the Carolingian world with Alcuin of York and company, and then that's the form in which, or that's the example that Alfred the Great probably has in mind when he starts on his whole, his whole sort of revival of learning thing. So you have what you might call, you have a series of sort of renaissances that start with the start in the Abbasid Empire in the 8th century and proceed basically, without much interruption, without many setbacks in the West, all the way up to what we call the Renaissance. So to think of the Renaissance as this kind of unique moment that sort of comes out of either nowhere, or it's just simply people like Petrarch reading Cicero or something, that's completely wrong. It has a much larger, or sort of much sort of deeper genealogy, and it's part of a trend that has been going on and on and on for hundreds of years since the Abbasid heyday, and even before that. The Abbasids themselves are, as they tell it, they're following the example of the Sasanian Persian kings who sponsored programs of learning and scholarship and so forth. And in particular, they cite the example of Khosrow I, who's a contemporary of Justinian. So you can see that in both directions. You can see that none of these examples, or these sort of milestones in the history of civilization, none of them can be separated from one another. Each one builds on the last, and each one is an example of somebody imitating something older.
And of course, I wanted, speaking of the Abbasids and collapse of civilization, they would of course eventually fall themselves by the Mongol invasion and in 1258. And I want to talk about the Mongols a little bit as well, and their empire, for a brief moment, because as again, to refer to an older episode on the Golden Horn, we talked about how one day, even though they're mostly, people think about the rape, the murder, and how the atrocities committed by the Mongols, they also did a lot of good with it, especially, I would say, revive, or if you will, the Silk Road, and trade again, once again, to flourish under the Mongols empire, under the Pax Mongolia, as we discussed in our Mongol episode.
Well, there's something to that. But it has to be, I think it has to be very carefully qualified. First of all, the Abbasid Caliphate was ultimately too big to last as a unit. I mean, it was a unit for a good while, but it wasn't going to hold together forever. So Egypt is sort of destined to go its own way. You already have this sort of Iberian Muslims in North Africa have long since sort of faded away. But you also have in the east, you have sort of Turkic and Persian local dynasties who are sort of asserting their authority, asserting their independence from Baghdad long before the final destruction of Baghdad. And travelers, in the 11th and 12th centuries, travelers through Baghdad are already describing a city in decline. Decline, though, would not have characterized the condition of the Persian and Turkic dynasties. What they're up to is they're harking back to the Sasanian example again. They're often giving themselves sort of fanciful genealogies, connecting them with Persian kings, and purporting to revive the traditions of much more ancient Iranian kingship, although of course they are also Muslims. And this is the context in which, in the 11th century, the Shahnameh was written, the great Iranian national epic. And this is also the era of the great Persian viziers, like the Barmakids. They all have names like they inspire that guy Jafar in Disney's Aladdin. So they're called like Jafar or something. Anyway, the Shahnameh is an excellent example because it's written under a Turkic um, king, Mahmud of Ghazna, and he's sort of writing, he's sort of grafting this sort of Turkic dynasty that he's in charge of in onto the sort of the tree of a much larger and deeper Iranian history, in much the same kind of way, I think, as Roman poets like Virgil are sort of attaching Latin Roman culture onto a larger sort of Greek civilization and sort of appropriating it. The same thing is, it's kind of the same thing that's happening over there. Now, eventually, the same thing happens to the Mongols. The Mongols themselves have you talk about an empire. Yes, they had an empire. I don't think they were particularly good on their own at running the empire until they got advisors, either within China or within Iran. In the Iranian case, you have sort of advisors who are sort of bringing the Mongols into the larger sort of trend of Iranian civilization and monarchy, and I think that was ultimately quite successful. And much the same thing is happening in China. The Mongols get Sinicized, and eventually they do get replaced, but for a while they rule as legitimate Chinese emperors, and they're sort of written into the whole sort of Confucian tradition there. But yes, that stuff eventually does happen, but long before that, the Mongol conquests are, or the Mongol eruptions, really considered quite horrific. The death toll is probably exaggerated in all of the sources that we have, but the point is that you can construe that to mean that what happened was sort of unlike anything that anybody had ever experienced before. And it provoked a great deal of doubt. The destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate was a disaster, even though it had been in decline and you had sort of local Iranian and Turkic dynasties, sort of basically going independent. The fall of Baghdad is a huge blow to Muslim prestige, and it's effectively the end of the caliphate. There was supposedly a caliph in Egypt. There was the Turkish Sultan.
The Mamluk Turks, I believe, at the time.
Yeah, that was not universally. Neither of those were universally accepted, and to this day, there's no caliph. This causes a crisis within Islamic, within Iranian and sort of larger Islamic civilization, both. And there are a couple of different reactions to it, which I draw attention to in the book. The main, I think the most sort of impressive one is Sufism. Sufism is a reaction to the experience of destruction and carnage and the doubt and the questions raised by this great Muslim empire that had failed. Much the same way as I think postmodernism or existentialism, basically sort of the latter half of 20th century philosophy, is a reaction to the two world wars and the doubt and chaos that was provoked by them.
I do believe that the early Ottoman sultans, or not, maybe not sultans at first, but they followed Sufism, at least in the beginning. The Ottomans in the start of their empire.
They did. It was extraordinarily influential, and it's the sort of spiritual impetus for what many people believe to be the best poetry in the world, the sort of the tradition of Persian Persian mystical poetry under people like Sa'di and Hafiz, and of course the figure of Molavi, who's called Rumi in the West. All of this comes out of the experience of the decline of the caliphate and the Mongol eruption. Now, I want to suggest in my book that was ultimately a much more beneficial and ultimately humane reaction to that sort of chaos than what we have experienced in our own time, which is more like extreme radical doubt and skepticism about practically everything. But of course, the other reaction that wasn't Sufism was a kind of, it's represented by people like Ibn Taymiyyah, who, although he rejected relativism and so forth, he sort of fell back on a much more what you might call an originalist vision of Islam, rejecting philosophy, rejecting mysticism, and embracing a much more sort of puritanical, rigid form of it, which is, I think, unfortunately, that has sort of had the last word lately, and not Rumi.
Mm. And we do have to jump a little bit in time because we go into an entire civilization here in this episode. So, of course, which brings us to the Renaissance, which, is the cause of the Crusades, which the disastrous Fourth Crusade in 1204. We talked about this in again, I referred to one of the very first episodes on the podcast on the Byzantine Empire, episode 3, I think, where we talked about how the Renaissance wouldn't really happen without the Fourth Crusade. But let's talk about for kind of a renewal in Europe, if you will, if that's an appropriate word for it, that the Renaissance was.
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that what we call the Renaissance, if we think of it as reconnecting the two sort of halves of the old Roman Empire with one another and then with their past, I think that would have happened without the without the Fourth Crusade, simply because the foundation for it was already laid in the form of the so-called Macedonian Renaissance at Constantinople and the Carolingian one in Western Europe, both of which, as we say, have their impetus or inspiration in the Abbasid the Abbasid Golden Age. The question for me, though, is what would it have been like? What would it have been like if Byzantium had participated fully in it? If you look at, for instance, you compare the work of someone like Giotto or Duccio to the work, the frescoes, at least I think they're frescoes, the frescoes at the Church of the Savior in Cora, the Cora Church in Constantinople, you can see that something like the first, the sort of early stirrings of Renaissance art in the West are already fully developed in Byzantium, and it's really much more beautiful and dynamic there. So if the two halves had been sort of mutually influencing one another, as would have happened, I think, without the Fourth Crusade, I think we would have seen something much more extraordinary. I think it would be it's sort of I don't know how I don't know how to describe it sort of counterfactually, but I think that if Byzantium had participated fully in European intellectual life, that it would have been just an extraordinary
mm,
extraordinary development. And I think it also would have, if you think about, I mean, the influence of Arabic scholarship on the Renaissance, I think is always unfairly overlooked. Byzantium would have been a more it would have provided a sort of route into that as well, especially like without the geopolitical problems caused by the Fourth Crusade, there would have been a more sort of
mm,
unified sort of Eastern Mediterranean, and that would have been a sort of window onto the East. But of course, the real disruption, of course, the Fourth Crusade was horrific and disastrous, but the real disruption is the Mongol, the Mongol eruption that comes sort of only about 50 years after it, right? So, the real question is what would life be, what would the world be like without the Mongol destruction of Baghdad?
mm.
That one I don't know how to answer.
Yeah, we discussed this as well in our episode of Hostess Wisdom. I'm sorry for referencing so many episodes in this one, but there were so many scientific papers that were just thrown into the river and then lost forever. And how would the world look like if we still had those papers
Yeah.
and the scientific works that were lost because of the Mongol invasion? Would we be more developed? Would it have you know what it's hard, like you said, it's hard to imagine what the world would look like today.
Yeah, but I mean, on the other hand, I think that we have in our own time, like we have two examples at least of just sort of like horrific destruction, right? We have the
Mm,
two world wars.
mm.
What was destroyed there? I mean,
Yeah,
um, I think that I think that these calamities are less a question of the destruction of specific texts or works of art or whatever, and it's more about what they do to human confidence,
mm,
and the way they disrupt our sense of place and purpose in the world, and sap sort of intellectual or moral vigor. I think that is really the fundamental concern. I mean, of course, there was a lot lost in the sacking of Constantinople. A lot of texts were destroyed. We know that,
mm,
and we know what had we can point to things that existed, before and that are now gone because they were burnt.
mm.
Well, you know, as sad as that is, I mean, it's sort of ultimately the higher price was the dismemberment or the sort of permanent uh permanent divisions within the church, mutual um mutual suspicion and resentment that lingers to this day, stuff like that.
Mm.
As for Baghdad, I mean, it's like we will never uh
Experience it.
well, yeah, we'll never experience, but we're also never going. I mean, the Muslim world remains fragmented to this day,
Mm,
right? It's not just the texts that were lost; like the idea of a single sort of unitary uh, Muslim world is gone, and it's not going to come back.
You mentioned what we lost in the Second World War, and I'm going to bring up Joe Rogan for a moment, and I do have problems with the way Joe Rogan been handling these podcasts recently. I don't like the guy as much as I used to anymore, but he had a scientist on, and I don't know. Again, I don't know how reliable he is, but he mentioned when that space junk thing came about, that Churchill before the Second World War set of enough money. I just remember this when you mentioned what was lost in the Second World War, and he said that Churchill before the Second World War set of enough money for scientific research that could have gone, but it instead was used to the Second World War, of course. But he's argued that if this money actually went to what they were supposed to, we maybe could have figured out if we had celestial life, extraterrestrial life, in out there in the universe by now. If the money went that is put aside went to what they were supposed to do.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure.
I mean, that, again, I don't know how reliable he is, but that's just one example of what it must because of the Second World War. I just thought about it when you mentioned it.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Now, on the other hand, there obviously was an enormous amount of uh, technology that came out of both world wars. Both world wars are also they're especially the second one. They're examples of total war in which the entire economy is sort of put into action, and everyone and everything is sort of working towards victory on the battlefield, and uh, no one is sort of uh, left out. That is still the way it is, and in fact, I think that the Western economies are even more sort of it's no longer a wartime economy, obviously, but the point is that more people than ever before, and more things and machinery, you name it, more people and things are now involved in Western economies than at any other point ever. That comes out of that economic outlook comes out of the two world wars, as does a great deal of technology. So obviously the legacy is still with us, but and technological I guess what I'm saying here is technological and economic achievements have been ratcheted up significantly because of the two world wars. Question for me is that good? I think on the whole, I mean, it's really kind of hard to say. I think at this point, though, many people are beginning to question again whether industrial society is really worth it if it means that we destroy the planet, as many people believe, or is a sort of ever expanding capitalist economy worth it if it demands that you work to such a degree that you can't have a family, or that GDP has to take, enlarging GDP has to sort of take precedence over sort of any other, any other economic, political, or social concern, and like these things have all been analyzed, long ago by Marx, and I think there are very few Marxists left, but they still sort of talk this way. These concerns haven't gone away. They're arguably more pressing now than they were before because there's simply more people, and we're now looking at our societies in the West after nearly 30 years, or it's about 30 years, I think, of this idea of that we've won the Cold War, that liberal democratic values are top. They can't be beaten. They're going to spread inevitably. It's just sort of everything's on the up and up from now on. And I think a lot of us are realizing that that isn't exactly true. We shouldn't really have believed that. We should have put more effort into what I'm calling, civilization, rather than technological development and more efficient ways of killing one another and so forth. but I don't really have an answer for these questions. I just note that I guess I want to emphasize that they haven't gone away, and now they're sort of back. Like they came back with a vengeance because of COVID and a variety of other things. So when you're sort of sitting alone in your house, either actually alone or with your family, and you no longer have an office to go to or whatever, like, well, what are you actually doing? You have to focus on things that are of like ultimately much higher concern, right? And I think that part of my argument in the book is that we've sort of neglected these things over the uh, past generation or so, if not longer, and we should think about them more and not neglect them.
And I actually want to kind of end this podcast with just, I don't know if you've seen the TV series. There was a scientific series, sci-fi, sorry, sci-fi episode. The series, there is an episode that they travel back to the 21st century in a series called The Orville, and in the last season, and they talked about that. Now, what is it? There's a quote that kind of stuck with me. It says, this one of the guys said, "No wonder the 21st century has a bad rap, a bad reputation." Would you agree with that statement? Do you think that future historians will look at 21st century as kind of a bad rap in a sense?
The 21st century?
The century we are in now. Do you think that the future historian will look back at our time and kind of think it wasn't a great time to live in? What do you think about this?
I don't know if they would say that, but I mean, I think that we've now seen enough of the 21st century to say that going into it, from the end of the last century, that we were naive, that we let things slide, that we allowed our societies to deteriorate, and we are paying the price now. Now, we are richer. I don't want to pretend otherwise. We are all, on the whole, or on average, I guess, we are richer. We have more access to information, more access to food, more numerous. The world is more populous. There are fewer famines. People live longer. There are many, many, many measurements in which we could say we are doing better than possibly ever before. I think Steven Pinker talks a lot about this stuff. However, there are some key things, I think, some very important things in which we have really seriously failed. And I represent these in the books. For example, like we don't, there's no way to measure happiness. Can't do that. You can, however, measure the opposite. Suicides are, like embarrassingly and distressingly high in the West, especially for very young people. Things like friendlessness. Why is this happening? The sense of isolation has grown. Loneliness has grown since the end of the 20th century. Family formation or household formation is down. Birth rates are down. You name it. Fill in the blank. Pick other measures of this sort. Why does it seem as though we have failed to transmit any kind of culture in the West? Why does our culture feel as though it has either deteriorated completely or collapsed, or that it's sort of significantly sort of dumbed down? Everybody says that now. People who talked that way in the 1990s were laughed at. Not anymore. Like something is clearly wrong. You could also cite, like, I don't like getting into sort of culture war stuff, but the mere existence of the culture war in its present form is a very serious problem, I think, especially in this sort of Anglo-American world. I think it's mainly an Anglo-American phenomenon that sort of pollutes other places. But you have large factions of society that are quite isolated from one another, and who can't even understand one another. They're talking a fundamentally different uh, language, and many of the claims that are made make no sense. I mean, I cannot conceive of having grown up in the late 20th century, this part of the world is less demonstrably and obviously less racist and intolerant and so forth than at any other time in its history. Very obviously. It is also a time in which freedom of speech and so forth is at an all-time high.
Maybe not
Now,
in Russia right now, but yeah.
right, but like, how do I know this? Well, first of all, if there were no freedom of speech, you would not be able to complain that you had no freedom of speech, right? So the more complaining you hear, the more likely it is that, like, the freer you actually are. In societies without freedom of speech, there are no complaints. So, this is obvious, but everybody seems to be upset about something.
And
And I don't.
if I may, sorry, I want to go back
Please.
a little bit because you talked about dumbing things down, and I think this is true, especially in the children's TV programs that you see in today's world in the 20s now. But when I was young in the 90s, even you had people who, though you were entertained, like Sesame Street, for example, you had fun and you had tried to learn something. But in today's I was looking at some clips from today's children TV shows, and it's almost none of that. It's just dumbed down, pure entertainment. Though we of course had some of that in our time as well. It's still there's some TV shows where you try to learn, like they try to teach you something. And Mr. Rogers, though he's kind of dull in today's age, I'm not gonna lie, he was a fine example of this. But in today's
so it's not just that. If I may,
yeah.
It's not just that Mr. Rogers is trying to teach you something. It's not just that. It's that Mr. Rogers himself represents an ideal of sort of civic life that it doesn't exist anymore. And
that was just one example of many I can think of, but
Yeah, so like the idea that there's like a man who has an orderly house, and he carefully changes his shoes when he goes in, and his everything is nicely organized. I think that a lot of people do want to teach their kids that kind of sense of order and decency and so forth. I don't think that it has disappeared from life, but it has retreated into what I guess is an entirely private sphere. That there's no longer a consensus that Mr. Rogers represents an ideal that we should all aspire to. That's what I would say. And you can see it also. Like, I was shocked to watch, for some reason I had never seen it before, the Peanuts Christmas, or whatever it's called, like not Peanuts, Charlie Brown's Christmas. Charlie Brown's Christmas comes from the 60s, and I watched it this last it's a cartoon, and it isn't what I would say, I wouldn't call it sort of overtly Christian, although it does have long quotations from the Bible in it, from the Christmas story. But the idea is that these kids are trying to sort out the true meaning of Christmas. And what they light upon, or one of them does, is the idea that it's something, something beyond materialism, something beyond material concerns. It's not about, buying and selling things. It's something, it has a much deeper spiritual concern. Ultimately, a very simple, trivial message, you might say, but a message which has completely vanished from public life. And making a cartoon now in which people are trying to put on a Christmas show and so forth, it just wouldn't happen. But it wouldn't happen with any religion. There would be nothing aired in public that would suggest that there was any kind of particularly like deeper spiritual uh metaphysical significance to anything.
And I think this is true because, as you see in Star Wars, for example, to mention something, and one example, the new Star Wars, they let's say Brodu, or I hate the name, but Baby Yoda, if you will. I guarantee you, he was made to sell merchandise. That's the only reason he was made for the show. That they think Disney Star Wars thinking, we're going
Yeah,
to sell toys now with this guy, and let's create something that people love and people, maybe not relate to, but people find super cute, and it's gonna be a,
yeah,
that's
I think that you're right about
that's
that.
the only reason I think it was created to sell more merchandise. And I'm not saying the original Star Wars wasn't like that, but today's, with in episode 8, which was horrendous, you see this, the little birds kind of thing that Chewbacca eats. They're in the scene for 1 second, but after the scene, you see thousands of merchandise. No, maybe not thousands. I'm over
Yeah,
exaggerating, but you see all this merchandise with these bird-like things that in the Star Wars shops and Disney stores, or whatever. So
yeah.
it's.
I mean, honestly, this kind of thing is liable to turn you into a Marxist
Mm,
because it's just what it is the sort of invasion invasion of market forces into uh you know what was ultimately a kind of modern mythology or a story of spiritual significance. That's what Star Wars
mm,
was. It's kind of like Joseph Campbell, um, you know, sort of almost sort of Jungian uh, stuff, which kind of silly if you think because it looks like a western in space or something like that, but it
yeah.
ultimately has a kind of it does have a kind of spiritual undertone and a sort of uh, mythological aspect to it, which is obviously highly appealing. But then you turn it into just this operation to make money. It's just it's embarrassing.
I mean, I'm not saying that Mandalorian isn't good, but it's obvious why he was created, for just one example of consumerism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we have to fight this. I mean, I think a lot of people will probably criticize my book for the fact that I don't, there's not a lot of sort of saber rattling in it. I'm not
Mm,
declaring war on consumerism and so forth. But like, I just don't think that that's my job. I'm not that kind of a person.
mm,
But the I do feel angry about those things, and I think that we have allowed. It's just part of a larger problem. We have allowed sort of consumerism, neoliberal claptrap, and all this stuff to just to grow out of control at the expense of other far more important things. And let's just let's just give it a rest for now. So like,
and this kind of more fun idea. I mentioned we talked about a lot of civilization collapse, and this is kind of relatable, I think. But in Futurama, in the first episode, you do see that when Fry is in there frozen, you do see so all this civilization being broken down over thousands of years that it's frozen. And you see all these civilizations rebuilt and again and again built over. And do you think that's what in store for the future? Like if a nuclear war would happen, let's say, do you think like what we see in Futurama, for just one example, do you think that we will eventually rebuild and again, like with the Roman Empire, like with the Abbasid Caliphate, Ottomans, the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire, etc. All these empires that rose and fell. Do you think, let's say we almost annihilate the world in a nuclear war, do you think that we will have the ability to be able to rebuild civilization again?
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know what nuclear war would really look like or do, but if we're talking about sort of total collapse,
Mm.
we've seen this before. I mean, the collapse of the Bronze Age, that's an entire world system that just comes crashing down, right?
Mm.
We've seen stuff like that on smaller scales with the sort of ebb and flow of civilization and sort of city states in places like Mesopotamia or dynastic China, or the rise and fall of the Egyptian state and its civilization at the same time. It's not always the same everywhere. There are differences. But, despite the total destruction, the complete collapse, the complete forgetfulness of literacy, even forgetfulness of architecture, everything in say the Greek Dark Age, civilization still came back. As long as there are people, as long as there is some historical memory, I think that there's still some kind of hope. And if you think about the work of Alfred the Great, or Charlemagne and company, or Alcuin, more like, we can recover from particularly sort of dark, rough periods. It has happened before. It can happen again. It might take a long time. The Carolingian revival, it's sort of debatable whether that took a long time or not. I mean, Charlemagne is sort of 400 years or so after the first sacking of Rome. 400 years seems like a long time to us, but maybe it isn't in the greater scheme of things. And some civilizations, some cultures remain stable for longer than others. But there won't be, what I will say also, there won't be a revival. There won't be any recovery or rebirth, whatever we want to call it, until we can rediscover a sense of rootedness in space and time, which is what I make a great deal of in the book. There has to be some sense that we're here. We have ancestors here. We have descendants here. We owe something to all of them. We belong on this planet for the long term. We want to have something to hand on to our children, that sort of thing. These aren't popular ideas anymore. And I think that's the sort of that's the root of what I call civilization. And until that sense, that it's really worthwhile to be here, that we have a place and a purpose in space and time, we have something that we owe the past and the future, I would not be optimistic about a revival.
I mean, this talked about the scheme. Before we run up, I want to talk about this. Talked about the long scheme of things, and how that for the years wasn't that much. I mean, our species has been around for the past over 10,000 years, but before it's just maybe 5,000 years. It took us 5,000 years almost before we started what we call civilization. And in that kind of span, if you think almost, well, 20,000 years now that we existed, if you roughly, I'm poor at maths, but it's roughly thinking that that's not a long, and we have only with the modern age, it's only been around for half a century, maybe 1 century, what we consider the modern era. So it's not really that long that we existed as a human race or a civilization in a.
Okay, so what does that tell you? To me, it's a couple of things. I kind of have a bee in my bonnet about this. The way things are is not an indication that they are going to stay that way. That's the first thing. Okay, so it was definitely our own direct ancestors as a species who made cave paintings in the Upper Paleolithic. It's definitely the same people. Okay, we are related to them. They are anatomically, anatomically modern human beings, but they are very different from us. We are different from them. They are different from us. We have many things in common, obviously, but we are different. Why are we different? Well, I mean, that's one of the things I try to answer in the book. We are civilized now, or at least we should be, and we try to be. It's a different way of life. We don't move around as much. Although
But won't you argue with Charles Tinker that we aren't as civilized as we like to be? But that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah, we aren't right now, but compared to the Upper Paleolithic, that's a different story. I mean, I agree that in one sense, I am a cultural relativist, like what is his name, Franz Boas, in a sense that an Egyptian of the Old Kingdom, a Chinese bureaucrat of the Tang dynasty, an Abbasid scholar, they are all equally civilized, and they are all equally civilized in the same way. Okay, we have fallen short of that ideal. That's true, but we are nevertheless not at the level of the Upper Paleolithic. So things are not going to just stay the same. We have to, if we want to preserve institutions or customs or whatever it is that we want to preserve the way they now are, we will have to exert far more work, far more effort. We have to exert far more effort than we have been lately to make that the case. A lot of people, I think, have got onto this idea, and it tends to focus on the idea of the decline of democratic institutions. Well, everything will have a tendency to decline if you don't make more effort to shore them up, right? They don't just decline for no reason. Oh, sorry, they don't just, you can't just sort of wind them up and let them go and then they stay that way. You have to put more effort into it. That we really need to take that stuff more seriously. But when you think of the amount of time, you made a good point about time. For most of our history, we have not been what I would call civilized. For most of our history, we have been, the exact opposite. Additionally,
the Crusade is one example of money.
Sorry, say that again.
The Crusade is just one example of money where we are not civilized.
Right, and for a far longer period in the remote past, warfare was even more violent than it is in the civilized era. But additionally, we think of something like art, leave aside warfare. There's more that the period of the Upper Paleolithic, during which time there was no civilization, that was a far more prolific and creative period than the one we have lived through over the past 5,000 years. So what do I draw from that? Again, we are more similar. People now living are more similar to people who lived 5,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, whenever you want to place the beginning of civilization. We are more similar to them than we would like to admit. There has never been a fundamental break with the past, and the modern era. If some people date the modern era from the 1920s, maybe 1921, 1922. The modern era is a blip, tiny, insignificant blip there. There may have been many changes in technology and so forth, but it has not changed our nature. We are still fundamentally the same people. And what worked in the past will work again.
I think we're gonna round it up there. Thank you so much for coming.
I'm sorry, I've been babbling the whole time.
That's fine. I love a good conversation. So before we go, do you have any social media you want to share? Any where can people find your book, and which they absolutely should read. It's 200 pages long. You're reading it in a couple of days. It's an absolutely well worth it. If you like this episode, you should definitely check out this book. And then all the links you want me to put in the description below.
Thanks very much for having me here. It's a great discussion.
Do you have so this has been H12. We are available on Twitter under H12, Instagram H12. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Also, write a little review on Apple or iTunes if you have the time. That would help us out a lot. My name is Alan, and I'll see you next time.